Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this program is called World Watchers. It's broadcast number 709. It's July the 8th, 1985. It is a 1-hour discussion of political events in the United States and around the world. I got a letter from a longtime listener who asked me if I would answer some of his questions on the air, and one of them was, this is in quotes what he wrote, "My first thought and question to you, pardon me, what good does it do to blame Hitler for what Americans are doing or for what our government is doing?" He said, "I'm glad that you call attention to the fact that liberty-loving Americans must be vigilant and take actions to see that what is happening or has happened in El Salvador, Chile, and Argentina doesn't happen here in the United States, the death squads and so forth, but it could happen in America." And he asked me why I guess continually referred to the Nazis involved in these particular actions. Well, the reason I discuss those matters isn't that I blame Adolf Hitler for any single thing alone. Hitler is only one person who was put in by the multinational corporations, by the American and British banks, by the industries we have, really, like Ford Motor Company, General Motors, ITT. The only reason the Americans went after Hitler was when he was bombing England and invading England. If he had gone all the way to Russia, no matter how many people he had killed, and conquered Russia, he would have been our ally, just as China is our ally today. Hitler was America, and when we saw that he couldn't take Russia, when the troops couldn't take Russia, then we began to make arrangements from 1943 on through Allen Dulles and William Donovan and John Foster Dulles out of offices in Bern, Switzerland, and of course through the United States, through Rockefeller Center with William Stevenson from British intelligence. We made the arrangements to incorporate all the Nazi techniques and the persons who were working for Adolf Hitler into our post-war policies, our foreign policies, our economic policies. That's when that British American Canadian Corporation was formed. It took several years, and it was set up by May 1945, the same week the war was over, to rearm the German munitions plants. So our intelligence community altered from what was supposedly an innocent OSS that was making deals with the Vatican, with the Nazis, such as SS Karl Wolff and Heinrich Himmler, and Hitler's top agents. Our OSS became the CIA with the help of Hitler's very top agent, Reinhard Gehlen, who went back to Germany to be in charge of all German intelligence under the BND. So what you see in the news today is the result of the merger of these two countries. I wrote about that in my first article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, of the wedding of Reinhard Gehlen to Allen Dulles, and that we are the result and the product of that particular merger, and that the events we see taking place today can all be linked directly back to those particular people and when they set up their particular training camps, their ideas, their hospitals, their experimentation centers. America is Germany. It's more Germany every day, and all you have to do is read the papers to see that. I did promise to go back to Simon Wiesenthal Part 2 this week, and the Joseph Mengele story. We have enough outline to share. I have for the next 5 or 6 weeks, or maybe for the entire year. But there are events taking place in the news this week that I want to share with you, as many as I have time in the hour, that have their roots to those very things that I'm trying to illustrate every week. The merger of the German intelligence with the American intelligence, and with their teaching us their tricks. And the British had some very good tricks themselves, controlling Bombay and Singapore and Ceylon and India, all of India, not just Bombay, but Southeast Asia and South Africa. They had a few tricks up their empire sleeves, and we have used them and made America an empire, a multinational empire, and the countries that don't go along with us or we don't like, we effect a coup to make sure that they change their attitude and policies. Now, the American Bar Association is having their meeting this week, and after a call at the White House and by the National Security Council, they dropped their suggestion that the United States be involved in the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice We were afraid that they would slap our wrist for our policies in Nicaragua, which are terrorism that George Bush and Ronald Reagan don't address themselves to, particularly as Reagan spoke to that body of lawyers, 300,000 lawyers in Washington. And the other aspect that the national security got them to drop was regarding free flow of information across the American border, that aliens that are invited to the United States to speak should be able to participate no matter what their ideas from the past, and the right of Americans to travel abroad in spite of their past political beliefs which the president doesn't happen to approve of. They should be able to go. We're very strict on those things. Mrs. Salvador Allende couldn't come to Berkeley to speak last year, but the fascists can flow in and out whenever they want. Those things were dropped, and the National Security Council was set up by Reinhard Gehlen and the Nazis, instructing America. We never had one of those things before World War II. And then they come into the lawyers and say, look, for national security reasons, you 300,000 lawyers can't take a position on these matters, American aggression and the World Court, or curtailing the freedom of speech. And those are two symptoms of the Nazi regime, which America has adopted and is getting stronger about. Now, I'm going to run down some very important news stories that took place just this past week. CNN News carried July the 7th. It was a 12 o'clock noon broadcast. I didn't see it in any American paper or evening news, naturally, the network news afterwards, that Mr. Agca, testifying in Rome, said that he lied about the apartment he stayed in, that he visited. He was supposed to have visited Mr. Antonov's apartment in Rome. He said he never was inside the apartment. The apartment building complex was owned by Father Felix Morlion. He probably still owns it. He is part of the OSS and the CIA and Vatican intelligence, so therefore he would know the floor plan. And the reason Agca was so knowledgeable about the apartment the Bulgarian Antonov rented was because the owners and managers, or whoever it is that runs that complex, directed by the CIA, could give him the nth detail about the apartment, and he testified that he had never been there. Another article from Il Mondo, there were two from Italy, Il Mondo and El Espresso. Those were obtained by Ted Rubenstein and David Emery. We don't get them in this country. Il Mondo, April the 8th, 1985, has an article about Father Morlion and his organization, the Pro Dio, that fascist group that finances the far right and links to the Vatican and other areas, in the association of Father Morlion to Herbert Hunt, the relative of H.L. Hunt, and the Italian-American connections to the Dallas Millionaire, and the efforts to set up large amounts of money for youth organizations in South and Central America. I'm going to do more on that. I just want to call attention to it now, and I'll get back to these later. This isn't a coverage of these articles. I just want you to know what's gushing out in the news, and why I put off the Wiesenthal thing for just this week. Another member of the Hunt family's name came into the news just this week, Ward Hunt, another member of the H.L. Hunt family and the Dallas tycoon, and his association with Princess Michael of Kent. Her name was surfaced when Ronald Reagan was going to Bitburg because her father he passed away, Gunter von Reibnitz, Reibnitz. He played an important role with Richard von Weizsäcker's father, the current president of Germany, the two of them in the overthrow of Czechoslovakia. So it came out this week that she's allegedly having an affair or meeting with Mr. Hunt, Ward Hunt, and it may be very political. It doesn't even have to be sexual, but the British monarchy, the daughter of the SS family, and meeting in Texas and other places with Ward Hunt. So Herbert Hunt is linked in the Italian news this week to Pro Dio, Father Morlion, and the CIA, and Ward Hunt is linked to Princess Michael of Kent, the daughter of SS von Reibnitz, who was the associate with the father of the current president of Germany in overthrowing a democracy, which, as I say, was Czechoslovakia. L'Espresso, the Italian newspaper, May 19th, 1985, as a story about that apartment where Antonov lived. That is the only written account of it that I've seen so far. As I say, nothing in the American press. It was translated, and the gist of it is that Father Felix Morlion, with his CIA connections, leads the trail away from Bulgaria, the Bulgarian trail, going to the Italian and American Secret Service. The Italian Secret Service, the SMI, part of Licio Gelli, and the Masonic Lodge connections were grooming Agca on blaming the Soviets and the Bulgarians, which he's been talking about. And in Italy, there are these articles about the RCIA and Father Morlion, and of course that goes right again to the Dallas connections and to the Kennedy assassination. These people have links going back to the Kennedy assassination. In Rebel magazine, November 1963, when I wrote about the murder of John Kennedy and the Nazi connections to John Kennedy, I wrote about Father Felix Morlion of the Vatican. That's the November 1963 Rebel. If you don't have it, I have reprints that you can send for. Most of you should have it because these names will surface over and over again that I used in this small article. One small item on the Mengele family. Mengele's son keeps lucrative rights. The magazine rights he said he would give to the victims of the Holocaust, to Auschwitz, and to another concentration camp. But just today in the news, he is about to make movies about his father, television. There's already a $500,000 deal. He can make millions of dollars, and then the attorney Fritz Steinecker doesn't have to put money in the Zurich account anymore. The money can go to Joseph Mengele, and Rolf Mengele doesn't have any agreement to turn over to the victims of the camps any more than what the magazine had. But he is getting a hero's applause, and the bucks are rolling in for Rolf Mengele to show you the kind of response in Germany and around the world to his daddy's story. Another story having to do with death squads in the United States, terrorism, and I stress terrorism in this particular broadcast with a big T. The whole thing is about American-directed terrorism, is because of Ronald Reagan's speech to the bar associations and today, and the way that they cover up and obey everything he tells them. It is so disgusting. This story has to do with giving entire probation to 3 people who were taking $6 million from the United States to death squads in El Salvador. The title of the article is "Pair Given Probation in Attempt to Take $6 million from the United States." It's from a friend who mails me Houston Post stories, June the 13th, 1985. Roberta Dobasan, the head of the death squads down in El Salvador, and the close associate of the Arena Party, ARENA, was wanting to get back into power at the last election, and just before the election, 2 people were caught on a plane leaving Miami, Francisco Beach, Beche, and Oscar Rodriguez, and the Miami pilot, Gus Mistrelis, were taking a huge hunk of money to America to effect a coup again in El Salvador or throw over the elections and make sure Dobasan got in. And then he could rearrange, as he does so nicely, those notorious death squads. Well, they were arrested in Miami with the money. The 2 men involved were put on probation. It also involved drugs and narcotics. And George Bush, of course, it was to be the big king of the drug investigations, his task squad. The newspapers this week were filled with facts about the task squads being a total fraud. They didn't work at all. So now he's got a new job, George Bush, in charge of terrorism. The president asked him today, or the Law Association meeting their convention, George Bush in charge of terrorism. So they got off, and some more narcotics traffic and money for guns and killing. The courts get them probation and no problem at all. The massive violence that I fear is caused and surrounded about Henry Kissinger, Fritz Kramer, the secret Fritz Kramer always, but Kissinger particularly. And every week, I think, no matter what I broadcast about, I have to have a Kissinger watch because these articles just keep piling up. Mary McGrory sends a Mercury, June 26, 1984, also syndicated in main newspapers, the Washington Post, has a large story. Kissinger is the one who shouldn't be on TV. This has to do with the hostage crisis when Kissinger Associates and the CIA and the Defense Department were blaming television for prolonging the hostage crisis, whereas they were actually escalating their visibility. They can talk, Mr. Klein of the CIA and Jeane Kirkpatrick of the traveling embassy from every department of the government now on a appointed position by Ronald Reagan to determine where atomic bombs go. Henry Kissinger every day on the nightly news. William Colby, Arnaud de Borchgrave, Michael Ledeen, John Reese. All the experts came out of the woodwork to do massive television broadcasts on the hostage crisis. That's one reason I think the crisis is so created, is to get you used to their faces and to their poisonous pens. And she was saying that Kissinger shouldn't, it's a marvelous article, I'll go back to it later, is the one that shouldn't be on TV. Now, I've talked about the proposal to change the Constitution to make Henry Kissinger president. That first came up on tape number 574, December the 6th, 1982. There was a bill proposed at the House of Representatives. Well, this week, the Northern California Jewish Bulletin, June 24th, has an article, The Constitutional Convention Bill only needs 2 more states for a resolution to pass it. For the new Constitutional Convention, they need 32 states to ratify it, and 30 have done it already. So when those 2 go over the hill, they'll slip in the provision that a foreign-born can be president of the United States, and watch them slide in Henry Kissinger. He controls all 4 networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN, and he is not only the media person, but he's the man behind it. As a matter of fact, when Reagan was talking about terrorism at the Bar Association, he throws in the name of Alexander Haig, who he fired for reasons involving terrorism and the invasion of Israel into Lebanon, that he gave them the green light, and he also favored the Argentine military dictatorship against the British in the Falkland War. He's now quoting and talking about Henry Kissinger in his speeches. Lawrence Eagleburger, U.S. News, this past week, July the 1st, he's a member, vice president of Kissinger Associates. He has a long article on striking the terrorists, bombing them, making war in the Middle East. That's what it would lead to. Henry Kissinger has syndicated columns, huge columns, a half a page or an entire page of the newspapers. This past week, he burst out with another one, the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, and goodness knows what other papers. These huge pages just gushing with Henry Kissinger philosophy. And remember, it was Kissinger who was sent by Ronald Reagan to decide on the bloodbath and the death bath in all of Central America. Now, Henry Kissinger is on the board of the World Soccer Federation. He attended that Belgium game May 27, 1985, with Gianni Agnelli, the Fiat automobile manufacturer, who was an avid soccer fan. At that particular day, 38 people were killed, 400 were injured, 120 were hospitalized, but Henry was sitting in the audience. There were articles afterwards, I can't cite them all, one in the Washington Post, Soccer Barbarism Shows Our Civilization is Cracking. The funny thing is it was written by Michael Novak, a Knight of Malta, who doesn't object to terrorism of death squads, who sees that the soccer game is a clink or an opening to the civilization cracking, but hardly would you think by reading it that he's one of those people helping to crack it open. Another story sent to me from a subscriber of the broadcast in Kansas, from the Kansas City Star, June 30th. New Nazis are behind soccer violence in Germany, and it tells about when they don't like the referees, they yell, dirty Jew, and it's Sieg Heil, and the German soccer game is a real Nazi spectacle. The Simon Wiesenthal Center had a letter from their attorney, Mr. Mendelsohn. This was April 1985 that went out with his mailing that England and the National Front is an assault of violence against the Jews, the National Front Party. And I have about 6 articles from London and the London Times that members of the National Front were behind the violence that was taking place at the World Soccer Federation, and they've had other violence before, as I say, 38 killed, 400 injured, 120 hospitalized. Old Henry sitting right there watching it, coming from Germany, part of Kissinger Associates was formed in Great Britain with Lord Carrington, who is now the head of NATO. If that isn't violence and attending violence, passing himself as a Jew and watching the Sieg Heils and the Heil Hitlers and the Dirty Jew chance at the game and watching the assault at that particular affair, then writing large columns and not even calling attention to some of these world events while he inflates that giant, huge ego, and the mass media buys it up. Now, another problem appeared in the news this week that is very important and significant. Some of you, if you might have seen it, wondered what it was about. Edward J. Epstein is a author. I've always believed that he worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, but he did 2 books on the Kennedy assassination. One was called Inquest, that came out very early, challenging the Warren Commission, and the other one was on Lee Harvey Oswald. And other than that, he's written articles attacking people that went to see Jim Garrison, making fun of the researchers. He's no leftist. He's far right-wing, always under the nest of Reader's Digest and the CIA. In fact, it was Epstein who had an appointment with George DeMohrenschildt the day that he, under mind control, blew his head off. He was the primary witness to the Kennedy assassination, in my mind, because of his associations and participation with Lee Harvey Oswald. And when the House Select Committee was to meet again on their $6 million investigation, and DeMohrenschildt was to be interviewed on a particular day, he had been with Edward Epstein that day. So I'm giving you the background. I have no love for Edward Epstein, but Epstein surfaces at this time and period and accused the publishers, Knopf publishers, of making a phony book. It's a bestseller list. It's up to about 8 or 10 on the bestseller list of Arkady Shevchenko's book. Hard to pronounce? Okay. And he says that Soviet defector was lying about the book, and that the CIA wrote a book along with this man who recently came out with a book on the KGB, and that he used this material and created his character, and that the book is false. He bragged about how he was a mole in the CIA, and that this particular book was false. Now, the part that worried me was that when the spokesman for Knopf was interviewed on all the wire services, their first reaction was, this is a quote from the person, Ashbel Green of Knopf Publishers, KNOPF. They said, my first reaction was I had to be skeptical right from the beginning because of the person who wrote the article. He's a well-known conspiracy theorist. Now, that isn't a lone opinion, but those of us who challenge the government, who challenge those massive lies of who killed Kennedy, become not only conspiracy theorists, but people that you can't trust. As long as Epstein wrote a book, Legend, The Secret History of Lee Harvey Oswald, which raises questions about a defector, he questioned himself, or Inquest, she said that you have to stay away from that idea. Now, a friend who gets these broadcasts told me a story this week. I can't give you the names because I didn't get permission to do it. Maybe he'll give it to me. Of a well-known director of movies, a leftist director, so-called, whose alignment has always been with the left, not like Edward Epstein, who notably has always been with the right wing. And he sent him a tape that I did on Joseph Mengele a couple of weeks ago. Now, there's nothing political in those facts or information about Joseph Mengele. And he called this particular person and said, what do you think of it? And his criticism was, she has the Communist Party line. Now, I haven't seen a thing about Joseph Mengele, whether he's alive or dead, from the Communist Party. The Soviet Union has been amazingly quiet about the Kennedy assassination or the role of Marina Oswald or the Minsk radio factory. So here is somebody saying that to criticize the conclusion or the findings that Joseph Mengele possibly isn't dead, because there isn't a trace of physical evidence to Joseph Mengele at all. Pictures and diaries up to 1979, but no proof of his death. Even those x-rays that were sent from Germany were not x-rays. The teeth drawings were simply drawings, and I'll do more on the evidence later. Now, that isn't a Soviet line. I've always said, if you count the bullets in the Ambassador Hotel, if Sirhan has a gun that shoots 8 and the police department have 10, You are not necessarily a Soviet sympathizer if you call attention that the Los Angeles Police Department and the chief of police and the district attorney there are telling lies, because eventually the chief of police, Ed Davis, became a senator in California, and now he's talking about running a United States Senate seat to put Mr. Cranston out, Senator Cranston. And Evil Younger, the DA, went on to be the California Attorney General, and he's waiting for a Supreme Court appointment or an FBI, chief of FBI appointment. He's sitting around waiting for some big appointment. This thinking that to criticize your government, you are a communist, or to question the Warren Commission makes you a suspect to have any opinions or critiques about anything going on in this country is absolutely horrendous. And I want to stress the importance of that, because this kind of mentality is going to mean that anyone who's had an association with questioning the government is therefore suspect themselves. You can see how dangerous and how far those implications can go. Now, talking about violence and terror, the president is referring to terror abroad, 5 particular countries or states. There's a new company opening up in California called Warrior Incorporated. Warrior Incorporated is going to be run by Dale Dye. Dale Dye is one of the executives of Soldier of Fortune magazine, and he works, his cohorts there are people like John Singlaub, Brigadier General Heine Adderholt, the people funding the Contras, and he's going to consult with movies. Soldier of Fortune helped make the movie Red Dawn. That was made by MGM, and Alexander Haig is on the board of MGM. And it was played at the White House to thunderous applause, and Rambo was played this last week, of course, to a lot of applause. Now, Rambo's going to have clones, according to this story in the LA Times, and Mr. Dye doesn't like the way Sylvester Stallone held the weapon in his hand. It wasn't quite accurate. And what they want to do, according to this article in the Times, is teach the proper use of weapons and how to put them exactly as they are on the film. So what you're getting is not having to go to these commando schools, but learning that over and over again. And if you don't think that's a problem, keep in mind the fact that Rambo made $80 million in movie sales this summer, the first 3 weeks of summer. Mr. Dye said that his experience in Vietnam, 2 terms, and as a captain in Lebanon in the Marine, that he faced some tough adversaries, and that by opening Warrior Incorporated, he can help Hollywood duplicate a battlefield. And he wants to do that. So as an executive of Soldier of Fortune, he's leaving them now, in quotes, leaving them, but John Singlaub, who set up Soldier of Fortune, also set up a $100,000 computer that the Los Angeles Police Department could feed information to on law-abiding citizens. So being in L.A. isn't far from John Singlaub's Western goals. And Mr. Dye will be in Hollywood as a consulting firm on the way that Hollywood should separate their gross unintentional errors about combat. He said Stallone some of it was technically good, but when he fired an LAAW, a light anti-tank assault weapon from the helicopter, it had a back blast, and it would have incinerated the POWs in the chopper. So he's going to make it right. The Warriors Incorporated starts July the 8th with a movie by Tobe Hooper, Hooper. They're going to remake The Invaders from Mars, but this time it will be the Marines fighting the Martians, and he's going to show what real Marines will do. So from going to boot camp to the screen, he will be the authentic advisor, so what you see is what you get, and what you get is going to be in your heads and our heads as time goes on. America can't keep showing this to these bloodthirsty people and run out of countries when they run out of El Salvador and Guatemala and Nicaragua and take all of the Central American countries. Nothing much is left except America. I wrote about Robert Brown in the Rebel article again on John Kennedy's assassination. He's the publisher of Fortune magazine, And this Mr. Dye is the co-editor of Fortune magazine, who's going to open Warriors Incorporated. And I talked about the relationship of Robert Brown to the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. So again, the assassination teams are back in the news and will be until somebody wakes up and understands what's happening. We'll take a 1-minute break now and go back to some more USA Today. This is the way it really is. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast, the second half of this broadcast, is World Watchers, in case you missed the first part. July the 8th, 1985, and I'm talking about a terrorist concept in the minds of Ronald Reagan and the National Security Council, 5 small nations such as Libya, Iran, and the Shiites, and the Middle East, as against what the United States is doing to its own in this country and overseas, and has been doing, along with the Reinhard Gehlen agents, the Nazi agents, and the assistance of British intelligence since World War II. And many of the events that take place have their origin in the murder of John Kennedy, the power that these people got, the H.L. Hunt family, when that father should have been brought in for his role in the Kennedy assassination in Dallas, and then the sons and nephews that continue with the fascist links on to the Vatican and to Britain and to the Waffen-SS, the family of the Waffen-SS, the connections of Dallas, the Young Americans for Freedom that were brought there from Munich, Germany, and the William Buckley tentacles that go to, again, Buckley's a Knight of Malta, the Vatican. But a lot of the events taking place today that I've talked about and just illustrated have their direct links to Germany and to the United States, the Defense Department, and the intelligence community. And you could take each one of these and draw a direct line to those particular locations. Now, there was a coup in a very small place, PAULAU, P-A-L-A-U. Most of us hardly know where it is. On the map, it's one of several hundred small islands, 200 coral islands, a tiny place with 14,000 people. But a man was murdered there, the president, Remelik, R-E-M-E-L-I-I-K, this past week, very quietly murdered. And the next day, the vice president, who happened to be in the United States visiting, flew in and was sworn in. This is identical to Mr. Mubarak having visited the home of George Bush and going to the National Security Council and the Defense Department, then flying back to Egypt and sitting next to Sadat when Sadat was gunned down. And, of course, Mubarak didn't even have a scratch. The vice president was in the United States. Why is this little affair over in this tiny island important? He was giving the United States a hard time in terms of putting nuclear submarines on the islands. The president that was gunned down was opposing American policy. They were siding with New Zealand, hoping to link with Australia. And furthermore, this is the area where a lot of atomic testing was done, and it has to do with the proving grounds in Utah and the Defense Department chemical tests and bombing of the people in those particular islands. And this president was opposing the United States. The Monterey Herald had a story. It was syndicated July the 7th. Tough negotiations with D.C. President Remelik was giving Washington a hard time. The result was that this 51-year-old president was just gunned down. The vice president comes in and gets sworn in, and then, of course, the negotiations will ease up. And this small island is part of the Micronesia Island, and they were put under U.S. trusteeship in 1947. As soon as the war was over, again, in 1947, the UN Security Council said the United States could be responsible for PAULAU's defense and foreign affairs. They were the ones that got a bunch of bombing and testing on their islands. And this one article says, a compact of free association through these islands with the United States was to provide $1 billion in aid over the next 50 years, but it was held up because the Americans had qualms about anti-nuclear clauses in PAULAU's constitution. The word clause, that they didn't want nuclear submarines, and they were against their experiences, and they were a cause of concern for the United States because of their anti-nuclear sentiment that's emerging in the countries down there. And the United States wants the United States Navy, the vessels, to have the right nuclear capability to fill the entire Pacific Islands. And we wanted to use their bases, and Mr. Mehmet was to meet with the proper authorities from Australia and New Zealand. There's a South Pacific Forum that would take place. So he's gunned down, and you can bet that they'll get $1 billion. And the vice president was in the United States being briefed, and it has to do with our violence, because when the atomic war falls on our heads, that violence becomes our violence. What is PAULAU's assassination this week may be your death a few years later, because this is the way people who oppose our government are killed. And the reason they oppose them is that they're in the way of this big global nuclear, the assured destruction, that we will only lose 100 million in this country, but we can do it. Mutual assured destruction. That is what these crazies are aiming for. And while George Bush is lecturing, he attended services or demonstrations over in Germany before he met the hijackers being returned. There's a photograph of him in the New York Times with his hand on his chest, giving a military salute to the German army. He isn't saying a word about Air India. We lost one American on that airplane, a Marine, but Air India went down in the ocean with hundreds of people killed. And the newspapers are filled with stories of how they were trained to blow up the airplane. 329 people were sunk in the ocean, and our public officials never talk about the Sikhs, and it's spelled S-I-K-H-S, the Sikhs. We talk about the Shiites, not the Sikhs. And the suspects were trained at a camp in Alabama, but the members of that camp are again linked to John Connally, former Secretary of Navy, to Dominica, to the Nazis, to the Klans. And where are our public officials' outrage, except for one passing remark? The newspapers, the Associated Press, Wire Service had a story: paramilitary school could be under gun. And they cite specifically Soldier of Fortune and Gung Ho magazine. This was July 1985 that this story was carried on the Wire Service. Another story from the New York Times: Sikh suspects studied explosives at mercenary school in Alabama. I had that on the broadcast on Monday night, and by Tuesday or Wednesday and Thursday of that week, it made the Wire Service. This is June 27th. Another story: terrorist links suspected in Air India Japan bombs. Several people were killed in Japan, in addition to the 327 that went into the Atlantic Ocean. That was Washington Post, June 26th. And Ronald Reagan is getting simultaneously millions of dollars for the Contras. Congress changed their mind 2 weeks after they voted no. And television, even CNN, had a documentary this week on the atrocities of the Contras, torture similar to El Salvador military dictatorship. I couldn't believe it, on Ted Turner's broadcast. He seems to be showing the far right spokesman, and then he does throw in certain news that the other programs don't show, the atrocities of the Contras. So what do you do about those commando schools? In the United States, we train them. We train these schools to blow up atomic plants. We train them to kill particular people. We teach them to blow up airplanes. They're American trained. They're American weapons, sold in America, taught in America. Then they go up to Canada and make sure that this plane falls in the ocean with 327. Then our president is talking to 300,000 members of the bar in Washington, D.C. about a motley crowd that are over in the Middle East who've been deprived of all their rights and freedoms under Great Britain and France and the United States, and continuously oppressing them into the point that they are driven to terrorism. And then we can have big conventions about terrorism and let the macho president get up and give his speeches. Now, another story this week about the CIA links, and you've seen it many times, linked to the Beirut bombs, the June 24th, 1985, the San Francisco Examiner. The CIA denied that they were a part of that, even though 80 people were killed. It was a runaway mission. Sure, we trained them. Sure, they were acting without authorization. We taught them how to plant the car bombs. We teach them how to get the weapons. We teach them how to dress and act like terrorists. Then when a facility comes down with 80 people killed, we say, oh no, that wasn't us that you banged down. We meant you to use that, what, on yourselves? No, we meant it to use on other people. So the New York Times article with George Bush, he has his hand on his chest. It's June 26th, the Leslie Gelb article, where his hand over his chest, he's with helmet, Bitburg Kohl, marching past the German troops, and the title is Bush in Germany Discusses Shiites. Now, why doesn't George Bush discuss Task Force 157? Why doesn't he discuss the killings of people through the Nugan money, the Nugan Bank, all the violence America has done, the Letellier murder, the Ronnie Moffat murder? Why is he going around talking about Shiites when he's responsible and was director of the CIA when Orlando Letellier was blown up right in Washington, D.C.? Again, the super serious face of George Bush, your next president or vice president under Kissinger, if they can pull it, and Ronald Reagan, talking to these so-called prestigious graduates of law school, and telling them that terrorism is the biggest problem in the world and that it's centered with these 5 motley groups over in the Middle East. Now, another terrorism story that has large implications. They're so big that I didn't want to touch it very much until I finished with the Mengele story, but it has to do with Leonard Lake and Charles Ng and Caroline Lake's ex-wife in California. And the clues of it go back to history of the 1970s when Ronald Reagan was governor, and Edwin Meese was his legal advisor in California, and Dr. Jolly West, Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, had moved from Oklahoma. He was his momentary psychiatrist for that little bit of amnesia or epilepsy, the 1-minute epilepsy, with all the connections that Jack Ruby had in Dallas and Chicago and in New Orleans. So those 3 got together, Reagan and Meese and West, and tried to push in 1973 that Institute for the Causes of Violence that I did many, many broadcasts on and linked to Jonestown. Well, getting back to that same thing that they tried to do then, they're pulling out of the hat now because you see all this terrorism is created and can be identified as links to our intelligence community and agents from the past. A story in the San Jose Mercury this week, doctors to study Lake's brain for clues about violent behavior. The medical officials are saving the brains of Leonard Lake. There are no disappearances of 25 people linked to him and 9 known deaths, body bags and bones of approximately 25 people. And they're going to take his brains, and Dr. Vernon Mark, the same doctor that worked with the men from UCLA, and Dr. Sweet, the same doctor who did the brain surgery on Leonard Keeley that I talked about, Dr. Vernon Mark, director of neurosurgery at Boston City Hospital, associate professor of the prestigious Harvard Medical School. Mark is the author of Violence and the Brain. We'll look at his brains, and then they go back to something I've warned and talked about for how long? The Charles Whitman Texas Tower murder. This article refers to where 18 people were killed at the university in Texas, and his brains were studied to see if he had a tumor. And the idea is that you cut open slices of the brain to see what there is about these things that they had in common. Well, what if they had something in common? Do you open the brains of normal people to see if they have the inclination or the brains to kill? This was the beginning of taking brains of blacks after the riots, after Martin Luther King was killed, creating the violence and frustration, then giving the go-ahead by the government, the LEAA, and the federal funding to Dr. Mark and Irvin and Sweet in Boston, the green light to take brains from minorities, whether it's Indians or blacks or Chicanos particularly, and even brilliant scientists such as Leonard Keeley, who invented the Polaroid camera that went then into the hands of Mr. Land and the Defense Department. And Keeley became a vegetable out here in California with still the electrodes in his head. Well, these same people now want to take the slices of Leonard Lake's brains and understand those brains. Now, Ronald Reagan is president. He's no longer governor. Edwin Meese is no longer legal advisor. He's attorney general. And Caspar Weinberger is no longer head of the HEW. He is secretary of defense. And these were the men that were told by the Senate investigation committees cut out what you're doing at these federal locations and also, I suppose, state. This was federal investigation of mind control. Now, Frank Irvin, who went out to work at UCLA with Dr. Jolly West and Dr. Vernon Mark, his associate, who is going to examine these brains of Leonard Lake, and I know that this has federal implications, military implications, that compound out in Calaveras in California. They wrote a paper on the reasons for studying violence and doing surgery on the brain, and they cited their experimentations with Charles Whitman, how he shot 41 people and killed 17. But in their studies, in the congressional report, page 597, they said, Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, is another example about someone whom eventual murders could have been predicted. He had a history of repeated episodes of uncontrolled impulsive assault behavior before he attempted to assassinate General Walker, or kill Officer Tippit. He was involved in a number of street fights, and he tried to commit suicide by slashing his wrists when he was in Russia, and in addition, he beat his wife unmercifully on a number of occasions. Their neighbors noticed Marina's head, face, and neck were seriously bruised and were afraid one day he would kill her. Now, I've read 26 volumes of the Warren Commission hearings, and I would take those doctors to court if there was a court. They are using one lie after another lie after another lie to cut brains and make us a robotized society. Oswald wasn't the person who shot at General Walker. There isn't a shred of evidence Oswald shot at General Walker. There isn't a shred of evidence or proof that he killed Officer Tippit. As for his wife, all the people that saw her beaten or bruised were not people who actually saw her. They were third-person people who were told, like Anna Miller was told by Mrs. Hall, or Mrs. Bowie, Mr. Bowie, George Bowie was told by Jean DeMohrenschildt. It was all third person. He didn't beat Marina at all. She came over as a white Russian from Minsk, from that Belarusian operation that's written by John Loftus on the transfer of these Nazis and the far right wing into the United States. She came right out of Minsk, Russia, as did George DeMohrenschildt, his family in that background, and they told lies, but as far as beating her, he had no history of violence. The only lies about the violence came from the mouths of the very people who worked with the Defense Department, the CIA branch of the Greek Orthodox Church, and Defense Industry Security Command, the intelligence arm around the munitions plants, such as Gally Clark. She didn't testify, but her husband did, Max Clark, chief of security for Convair, people that housed them. In his term in the Marines, where he enlisted, not a problem. He was in charge and knew all the radiation secrets of the entire the Pacific area that he was in, training at 2 bases of the U-2 in Japan and in the Philippines, went off to the Soviet Union and worked in quotes at the Minsk radio factory, wanted to come home and got his passport back from the embassy, got the money to come home, was met by the World Anti-Communist League figures such as Spaz Reagan and the Leo Cherne I mentioned last week, and the network of CIA people that were at his home from the time he landed in Fort Worth until the Kennedy assassination is a mile long. So now these people are going to work on the brains of Leonard Lake. There are tremendous political significances here, and also those missing people. How do we know who they were and what their role was? And I'm sure many of them were selected to be killed. Now, the story this morning in last night's news is that Charles Ng, who worked with Leonard Lake, Dr. Mark will work Vernon Mark with his brains, and then he'll get Charles Ng's if he dies. There's a snag in the extradition. He knew to go to Canada with. They know who drove him there. They knew where he stayed there. And by being picked up in Calgary, Canada, or any city there, his attorney already has a clause going back to the 19th century that he doesn't have to be extradited. I'll be very surprised if this trial ever goes on, just as I predicted. The Klaus Barbie trial couldn't start until Mengele was dead, and they probably don't believe Mengele's dead. And so in January, it'll be 3 years that Klaus Barbie is sitting in a jail the trial can't start. Charles Ng could be sent back to Hong Kong, deported to Hong Kong, where he originally came from. He was caught taking weapons in the United States Navy, in the Marines rather, in Hawaii. And another shocking story of his military records came out this week, just showing the implications and the collusion of these people. It is so horrendous. This is the San Francisco Chronicle, Saturday, July the 6th, 1985. Military records, Ng spoke of slaying when in the Marines. Now, this guy was in the stockades because he had taken 2 machine guns, 3 grenade launchers, 4 M16 rifles, 7.45 caliber pistols, and 3 Starlight scopes for night shooting. And he said that the Marines was boring. He wanted to get out because nothing happened and there was no action. So he had a Marine attorney who represented him there, and he got off on that. He escaped from all of this and came to the United States. He said, he told the attorney, I consider myself a good liar. I know how to kill. If you know how to kill, you make friends with somebody because then it's easy. They don't know who you are, and your best friend is your enemy. And then he boasted to this attorney back in July 82, 3 years ago, that he killed a California man, that he set off a bomb in California, that he shot and killed the owner's livestock, that he put potassium cyanide in a salt shaker in the Marine mess hall, that he tried to kill a staff sergeant. The attorney never had anything on the record to look up these things that probably all were proven to be true. And I believe that Charles Ng and Leonard Lake were running the kind of a castle that Franz Stengel trained at in Germany, where they had a location. I'll do more details on that for you later, and taught how to kill and took photographs of people, just as these people had videotapes and detailed photographs of the various people up there. Germany ran these testing places before they ran the mass concentration camps, and they would take pictures such as gassing a person for 3 minutes or 2 minutes and 1 minute and watching their agony, then sending the pictures to Berlin to show the degree of time particular doses do and how they die. And they had schools for murder, and these schools were done. They wanted to train those people to learn to kill their own, like for Austrians to kill Austrians, because it's easy to take hunchbacks and Jews and mentally fit or the aged, but they wanted to get their tolerance for killing their own. And this place in Calaveras is only one across the country. You'll find that there are a lot more, but of course California is the nut house. Ronald Reagan here 8 years, and Edwin Meese, and our Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Jensen. And you know how many times I've talked about the California violence. Well, Mr. Ng had no record in the Marines of seeing a military psychiatrist while he was in Hawaii. And again, Hawaii was and is a place for training mind-controlled zombies and various mass murderers from California. And Mark David Chapman was sent to Hawaii for his dose of it before he ended up in front of the Dakota Hotel killing John Lennon. No record of this attorney checking out these things. He simply left the Marines. He's the son of a Hong Kong, in quotes, traveling cameraman who managed to have his son going to school in London, and I believe he probably started very young as a candidate for such as the Tavistock school there, run by the late John Rawlings Rees, and went from London to the United States and to the Marines, but kept the Hong Kong passport so he could be sent to Hong Kong and never be tried. Carolyn Balazs, that's B-A-L-A-Z-A, B-A-L-A-Z-S, I'm sorry, is the ex-wife of the late Leonard Lake, although I've mentioned before that she was close to him up to the moment that he was dead and helped Mr. Charles Ng get out of this country. He got out of this country by a lift of somebody he corresponded with in a prison. He was 2 years in Kansas, and this is very important, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, because from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas comes the new director of the Texas prisons. The head of it, Raymond Percunier, has just left there, I guess to get a high appointment in this administration. They've had enough murders and squabbles there, and I'm not going to detail Percunier's record in California now. I've done a long ago, many hours on Raymond Percunier. But the new director of the Texas Department of Corrections comes from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and I'm sure that he and his gang knew Charles Ng there. Another story about Leonard Lake's wife, always the ex, like ex-Nazi, This is out of the San Francisco Chronicle, July the 2nd. Oh, pardon me, San Francisco Examiner. It is Examiner Chronicle, but they have two different editions during the weekdays. Blake's ex-wife suspected of recruiting models. Now, where do you think she worked? She worked at the juvenile hall in San Mateo County. And the probation authorities are investigating her work because in charge of juvenile probation, she had taken 21 young women who happened to have their snapshots on the wall of Lake's bunker up there. It's in Calaveras County, Wiselyville, California, Wilseyville. Now, this is exactly like Jim Jones or the school at UCLA. Give us your poor, give us your ones on probation. We'll mind test them, we'll drug test them, we'll electrode them, we can kill them. Human beings are part of a meat and sausage factory. Anybody who's done a minute's research would back up the stories I've been telling you for a long, long time. And finally, I have time for just one more. It has to do with that doctor at Bethesda Hospital who has been charged with 4 or 5 manslaughters with murder. And a woman, Lily Grubb, got a telephone call this last week. And this is the way it began. It was from a Rear Admiral William M. McDermott, Jr., and he called her on the telephone, and he said, I believe Dr. Donald Billick killed your father. And this is the story of her father going to Bethesda Hospital. They lived in Virginia. He was retired out of the military, and they made a point in this story to tell us that this poor Mr. Grubb, Franklin Grubb, he was an Army major, William Franklin Grubb, was drafted in the Army before World War II, and then Frank Grubb had served in the infantry during the Battle of the Bulge and returned to the battlefield a few years later in Korea. There are endless deaths of people, witnesses to the Battle of the Bulge, witnesses of a Fritz Kramer at the Bulge, 2 Fritz Kramers, Hitler's Kramer, America's Kramer, or are they the same? Henry Kissinger in the Battle of the Bulge. David Emery is collecting articles of violence against people involved in the Battle of the Bulge that have been taking place this last year or two. And this man is operated on by a person who wasn't supposed to do surgery, who was taken out of a New Jersey hospital and put at Bethesda where the presidents and senators go. No subtlety in this one. You can sue the U.S., she's told. Is that the way to get a telephone call? What does she sue? What, 1 or 2, 3 million? Okay, taxpayers. He does the surgery. You pay the bill. Put it to the national debt. It runs into the trillions. Mrs. Grubb gets a call. See how unsubtle this is now? The Washington Post runs a story. June 27th, 1985, a front page story. A phone call from an admiral. The widow of the Navy's doctor patient advised to sue U.S. Well, at first, he got on the telephone. He said, that Dr. Billick killed your father, but it actually was the widow of Dr. Billick, and that's the phone call she gets. Well, when an admiral picks up a phone and says, you can sue the government, you know this has to be a bad case, because usually these medical things, people have to fight and say, okay, he's wanted on 4 manslaughters, but they were innocent, the arteries broke or something happened to the patient. Doctors bury their mistakes. When the federal government has 4 homicides on a surgery table in Bethesda, Maryland, where our congressmen and congressional aides and, as I say, the president and his family go, when they're charging them with homicide and they're picking up the telephone and saying, you can sue us, we killed your father. You don't have to be very subtle about that. I mean, I don't even think Adolf Hitler got on a phone and called somebody and said, I killed your mother. They let them guess what happened. This country is getting so blatant with its violence that you have to just look at these news stories and wonder how much further it can go. Not only the hypocrisy, but the way it's coming out, it is horrendous. And I don't know how to offer a suggestion on what to do except to look at the people who are running this country, like we try to do, and study them. This government investigation, the Committee of the Judiciary, Senator Sam Ervin's investigation on individual rights and federal role in behavior modification. On page 348, it says, Memorandum on the Center for the Study of Violent Behavior and Who is Violent. In its January 1973 State of the State message Governor Reagan announced the formation of a center for the reduction of life-threatening behavior. Several proposals have been drafted and submitted to Dr. Stubblebine, and the Committee of Senate Health and Welfare in California will look into the project. It's called the Center for the Study of Violent Behavior. I think we should take the experts into Washington, D.C., and study the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the White House, and even the members of Congress who just want to kill and fight and bomb and blockade and scream and yell and make not a cottage industry but a multi-billion-billion-dollar industry out of death, out of killing. It is horrendous, and I don't know how long it can go, but it has to get worse if there's no solution. This is enough on this violence. Now we'll go back to the very mild Joseph Mengele, who just did a few deaths, a couple of million. These people have in their hands the plans or the intent to wipe out almost everybody on this earth. Can't compare Mengele to them, but we'll go back to Mengele anyway, a small fry compared to these people. And we'll go back to Simon Wiesenthal and his relationship to the SS Gestapo. Simon Wiesenthal and the Gestapo. That will be, I promise, the whole broadcast for next week. This is Mae Brussell. You take care. Thank you for the articles and books you're all sending me.